Here's where we're at, right? So if Locke admits that there could be ideas of memory, that is, ideas that are in the mind but one is not aware of, why couldn't that be the model for innate ideas? And his answer, though not explicitly, is in his account of memory. In other words, he doesn't think that when you remember things, it's like memory is like a storehouse, like a storage room where you put things and then you close the door and then you open it. No, he believes that ideas in memory are not really there. It's got a dispositional account. This is what he says. You tell me where you believe it. So Locke says, our ideas being nothing but actual perceptions in the mind, which cease or stop to be anything when there is no perception of them. This laying up of our ideas in the repository of the memory signifies no more but this, that the mind has a power to revive perceptions, which it has once had, which this additional perception next to them, that it has had them before. And in this sense it is that our ideas are said to be in our memories, when indeed they're actually nowhere, but only there is an ability in the mind, when it will, to revive them again. So Locke didn't write in the clearest way. It's very ornate. But what he's saying here can be summarized like this, right? So here's what he wants to say. That's what he says in this passage. An idea of memory is in the mind as a capacity of thinking that idea explicitly. So what he wants to say is that when you remember an idea, it's not that you put the idea like in some storage there, but no, it's just kind of the idea disappears, but what remains is like kind of a trace, like a placeholder for that idea, a specific placeholder. But there are two important restrictions. So an idea of memory is in the mind as the capacity of thinking that idea explicitly. One, because that idea was explicitly perceived by the mind before, and two, only if its revival occurs with the additional perception that the mind has had that idea before, on pain of not being an idea of memory at all. So in the mind, there can only be like this specific capacity to think of a particular idea because this capacity was grounded, one, in previous awareness of this idea, because that's an idea of memory. According to him, well, all ideas come from experience, right? So you cannot have an idea of memory unless you've been aware of that idea before, right? And second, when you're having an idea of memory, you also have to be aware that it is an idea of memory, this is very... I remember I gave this talk, this lecture at the Coxeye Center at Rutgers, and Randy Gallisto immediately raised his hand and said, "Oh, so suppose I seem to remember that I've had that idea before, but I'm wrong. Does that count as an idea of memory for Locke?" Yes, unfortunately, yes. But so that's his account. So that if you believe this, then remember his awareness principle can be revised as follows. So what he wants to say, I call this now A prime. What he wants to say is that an idea, so that's the expanded awareness principle, right? An idea can be said to be in the mind only if either the mind is currently aware of it or it has been aware of it before. So there are only two conditions under which you can say that you have an idea in your mind. Either you're thinking of it or you have thought of it before. And in that case, you just have the capacity to recollect it. Once you have this in place, then of course this refinement of the awareness principle makes it, or A prime, what I call A prime, makes it impossible for innate ideas to be like ideas of memories, right? For Locke, because innate ideas are unlike, they're not like Lockean memories, because innate ideas are ideas you're capable of having, but this capability is not based on previous awareness of the idea. So it's because of Locke's views, Locke's own view of memory, that you cannot tell Locke, well, you're made of ideas of memory, then you can admit of innate ideas. So this arguments complete his attack on cognitive dispositional nativism. So let's look at the other part. Remember that, so Locke said, nativism is either the view that there are innate ideas in the mind, and he explained to you why this can't be right, or, so he believes that this version is false for the reasons I just gave, or it is the view that there are some innate capacities, not the actual ideas. Well, here I have a quote from Susan Carey's book where he says something similar. He seems to give this version of the innateness hypothesis. What she says is that so we've seen already, Descartes endorses this kind of dispositional nativism, this version of dispositional nativism, and so does Carey when she says, much of the knowledge in core cognition, she means the concepts which are, he believes there are some concepts which are central and basic concepts, like the concept of number, the concept of intentional agent, and the concept of object, for example. So much of the knowledge in core cognition is embodied, she says, in constraints on the processes that create the representations of ongoing events. So you see the difference here. She's not saying that the representations of the representation of object is innate. She says that what's innate are some constraints, which there are some constraints on the processes that create the representation. So the representation is not already in there. Right, so that's the difference. But she's a nativist. So Locke is asking her, right, this. I'll read you, this is the most famous, this is one of the most famous passages in the essay, and what has, gathered the greatest applause by contemporary empiricists. So he says, Locke, let's suppose that nativists agree that to say an innate idea is imprinted in the mind, and yet at the same time to say that the mind is ignorant of it, is to make this impression nothing. Here is only saying, well, let's suppose the nativists agree that there are no actual ideas there. And so, and hence that there's only the capacity to know that idea, like Carey is saying, right? Okay, says, let's see. So if this is what the nativist is saying, then I got him, right, or her. Then I can create trouble, I can raise my criticism. So he says, well, if the capacity of knowing be the natural impression contended for. This great point, while it pretends to say the contrary, says nothing different from those who deny innate. The capacity, they say, is innate. The knowledge is acquired. So the capacity is there, but the representation is acquired, right? Not sure whether acquired is the right word, but then, to what end such contest for certain innate maxims? Like, if truths can be imprinted on the understanding without being perceived, I can see no difference between any truths the mind is capable of knowing in respect of their original. They must be all innate or all adventitious. Adventitious is an early modern term from coming from the environment, coming from experience, coming from outside. In vain shall a man go about to distinguish them. So that's his big point, right? So if the nativist hypothesis boils down to the claim that there are only some capacities which are innate to create some representations as opposed to others, then you cannot distinguish. There's no substantive distinction between innate knowledge and acquired knowledge, because the capacity is innate, but the knowledge is acquired. So now at this point, we know what are the different options of spelling out the innateness capacity, the innateness hypothesis, at least in the authors have been looking at, the early modern period and contemporary period. Maybe there's some other way I don't know about, and that could be helpful. But of course, I am thinking of the debate from a psychology and philosophy perspective, and not so much from a neuroscience perspective. So neuroscience have different issues and different way of probably of approaching the problem. So what I was saying, remember that Locke's attacked the first version of nativism, the cognitive ones, by essentially attacking the notion of implicit knowledge. He doesn't believe that we can say that there are propositions or ideas in the mind of which we're not aware or we haven't been aware in the past. Now, this criticism actually, although it may seem absolutely weird to us, right? This commitment to awareness of ideas in the mind, it's a criticism which comes from, really Locke is defeating, so he's attacking Descartes or the Cartesians, right? So the principle, the awareness principle, seems to be grounded in actually some principles of Cartesian philosophy, the notion of the transparency of thought. So it's kind of Locke is defeating Descartes on his own grounds and just saying, look, Descartes, okay, this is definitely different from contemporary nativists. You can't, look, Descartes, you can't really say that there is implicit knowledge, because you remember, you proved that the mind is distinct from the body, and that the mind knows everything which is going on there, right? Right? So he's saying, so you can't yourself defend this view. So this is in this slide. By the way, if you want this is a paper which is going to be published in, like Cambridge and Oxford do this Cambridge Companions, right? So it's going to be published, whenever you, companion to the essay, right? So I don't know when. I already submitted it. So, but if any of you is interested in reading it, okay, maybe more slowly at home, I'll be glad to give you the draft of the paper on the assumption that you're not going to circulate it, of course. And if you have questions, you can ask me by email or later. Well, I guess it would be by email. But so is Descartes really? So what would Descartes say to this kind of criticism? I think he has a way out. He has a way out because I think that, if you look at the texts, it's true. I mean, look, there are a bunch of issues here. The doctrine of the transparency of thought. So Descartes believes that the mind is distinct from the body. So, of course, our knowledge of bodies is mediated through our ideas. But the content, because nothing is closer to the mind than the mind itself and its ideas and the object of these ideas, then the contents of our mind should be transparent. You should be able to know them, right, much more easily than. So, but, well, one, there's so much literature on the transparency of thought in contemporary philosophy of mind. One, I think the doctrine can be interpreted in many different ways. Two, Descartes' view is a little more sophisticated than that. I don't think he's committed to the view that everything is just absolutely transparent. Well, for one thing, he believes that there are some obscure ideas in the mind, right? The ideas of the senses. So Descartes qualifies, I'm reading from here now, qualifies his claim that we are aware of everything which is in our mind by saying that there can be nothing within me of which I'm not in some way aware. So he seems to be committed, if this makes any sense to you, and maybe not, but he seems to be committed to the presence of degrees of awareness. And in particular, he distinguishes between, ideas you're attentively aware of, like, just you have the idea and you're aware that you're having the idea. And non-attentive awareness. You're having the idea, but you're not aware of having the idea. So in a sense, you're aware of the idea because you're having it, but you're not attentively aware of it. So it's just like second-order awareness. And so trying to defend Descartes, I'm going to develop this distinction. So if you take this distinction seriously, then you can cash out Descartes or explain Descartes' notion of implicit knowledge of a principle as some kind of knowledge. It's knowledge of a principle you're not attentively aware of. So you are in some sense aware of this principle, but you're not attentively aware of it. So that innate ideas could be ideas you're not attentively aware of, and you may not need to be ever attentively aware of. You're in some way aware of them, but not attentively aware of them. They're implicit. So the sense of, an idea would be implicit if you're not attentively aware of it, which doesn't rule out the possibility that you must be in some sense be aware of it. You're just not aware that you're aware. I think that Descartes must have had this in mind. Whether this is workable on theoretical grounds, that's an important but separate issue, but I think that Descartes would allow for this. And so if that's the case, Descartes can avoid collapsing the notion of implicit knowledge to a contradiction. Well, why or how? Because implicit knowledge isn't knowledge the mind knows and does not know, like Locke wants to say. So essentially, according to Locke, implicit knowledge involves a contradiction, because if it's knowledge, you got to know about it. It can't be implicit. Rather, implicit knowledge is knowledge that the mind knows but does not know about or pays attention to. So in this sense, it could save its notion of implicit knowledge and reject the awareness principle, the way Locke phrases it. In some texts, implicit knowledge, even in the early modern period, is translated as tacit. Yeah. Tacit or implicit. Now, Descartes has particular problems that Chomsky or other cognitive psychologists may not have, precisely because of this transparency principle. I think that's exactly the way I think of it. That's exactly the way I think of it. But then people will come back and just say, well, Descartes is not really entitled to this notion of tacit knowledge, because some people would just say, right, tacit knowledge is like, you may not ever be able to express it, right? Or access it. But Descartes says that everything which is in the mind is accessible. That's why it's a problem for him and not because of the dualism. And this could be, very well the case that, so Descartes' notion of dualism is iffy, right? So maybe this is like one way in which, so that's why it's not a problem for them, because they're not dualists in any way, and nobody would be committed to the transparency of thought. My belief is that Descartes is essentially saying what contemporary people are saying about tacit knowledge, and my view is that actually he doesn't hold the transparency of thought. Do I believe? Yes, I do. I do. I think that the most, that's precisely the issue I am trying to. So I believe that I think that there's a lot which is innate in our mind, a lot. Some basic principles. I don't know whether we can talk about knowledge, and I'm not a linguist, so I've read Chomsky's critique of Skinner. And I read some other articles, but I'm not up to speed with the recent stuff. But I have lots of friends and a husband who do philosophy of language and linguistics, and he's talking more about parameters, right? He's not talking about knowledge so much anymore. And that, again, so you go, and you look at Jerry Fodor did the same. So in 1975, in his book on concepts, he's talking about ideas being innate, and then lately he's talking about learning mechanisms, which are domain-specific, being innate. So that's precisely the question I'm asking. Why this ambiguity? What explains it? Are they maybe they're saying different things when they talk about different issues from a different perspective? Like Jerry Fodor went as far as saying that maybe the question of nativism is not something for cognitive psychologists to inquire about. We're talking about the origins of knowledge. So whose job is it? The biologist, maybe? Maybe the biologist. So I guess it really depends. The way my intuitions are going is that it depends on at what level of explanation you want to ask the question. If at the physiological, neural level, or the psychological level. I don't know. So anyway, yeah, but I think that so he's definitely thinking of innate ideas as tacit knowledge in the same way. All I'm saying, I'm trying to find a way of making sense of the presence of innate tacit knowledge in Descartes vis-a-vis his commitment to the transparency of thoughts. That's okay. So that would be one way of, this would be one way in which a dispositional nativist like Descartes could reply. And I'm sure that like Elizabeth Spelke, Chomsky, Susan Carey would not be moved at all by this criticism of Locke's. But they should listen to the second one, which I think is more pertinent. I think it just, it really also targets their views.